Welcome Internet. Today we're going to be talking about the very complicated and subtle relationship of very early psychoanalysis with trauma. So here I'm going to have to define what I'm talking about. When I say early psychoanalysis, I mean first generation analysts such as Freud, Ferenczi, Ernest Jones, Carl Abraham, Jung, Adler, and so on and so forth. And when I mean trauma in every sense of the word. But what is very interesting is that at the very start of his work, Freud believed that a traumatic event in reality, for example, like incest or physical abuse, created psychopathology, namely hysteria. However, and this is where it gets quite complicated, is that he went back on that. In his letter to Phyllis, which I'm saying in French because I'm not sure how you say it in English, he says that his theory of the neurotica, i.e. real cause event equals psychic damage, which then equals psychopathology, is flawed. So for Freud is, at that point is gonna splinter off this idea of trauma into two big categories. External trauma, i.e. something has happened and it creates pathological manifestations, and internal subjectivity and fantasy, which can be traumatic, but that's not necessarily real in the fact that that didn't necessarily happen in the real world, but has been fantasized by the person. So it's going to be one of those tricky questions which is going to divide psychoanalysis for a very, very, very long time. As fundamentally, Freud, when confronted with the numbers of people who were sexually abused, did not take it at face value. For him, there was something wrong. There was too many abusers. So therefore, something was wrong with his theory. Thus, he started to take a step back with this idea of real-life abuse and then focused on fantasies. And those fantasies then became psychic manifestations of taking the appearance, the allure of trauma, but wasn't based on trauma. So I want to be very clear on the fact that for me, Freud's reasoning for getting out of the real life trauma and dismissing it in a way was very flawed, because you have to put this into the context of who Freud was and what was the context of the time. The context of the time was that sexuality was a complete taboo, and abusers were getting off because good father figures were often non-criticized by that society, by that era. And what Freud discovered is that those fathers, those even mothers that were abusive, were not rare, and they were not some kind of marginal exception and antisocial behaviors. They were much more spread in society, and even in so-called good families, there could be those issues. And I think, and please keep in mind, I'm not a historian, but I think Freud was deeply terrified by that, because that his theory meant that something had gone really, really wrong, and not in that exceptional sense, but in that very common today life sense. I think that frightened Freud in a way, because that was also the start of criticizing the whole system, which I think that was not what he really wanted. What he really wanted was to create a completely conventional way of understanding the mind. The mind was central. So that's my personal take on it. I also think that perhaps Freud was unhappy because it gave too much significance to what happens externally, when he really, really wanted to focus on inner subjectivity. So what happened after that is that it kind of split psychoanalysis right down the middle. For some analysts, it became paramount to only study subjectivity, while for others, real-life trauma had to also be integrated into psychoanalysis. And it's a point of tension, which even though nowadays it's much less so, there's still remnants of it in psychoanalysis right now. But what was very important is that at that time, Freud really wanted to go into internal subjectivity, meaning that external trauma became less and less important for him. However, and has to be nuanced, he made a lot of back and forth, because when we say he abandoned his theory of neurotica, is that he might have officially abandoned it, but you can see that with his patients, sometimes he went back to it. So it's not a clear and cut issue, and I think we often, in the way we present it, trivialize he let it go and it was over. It's not really that. He was very ambivalent with it for the rest of his career, really. But what happened is that he really, really wanted to stay focused on psychic fantasy, i.e., for example, the hysterical patient. Instead of saying she was abused, thus that created the hysteria, he then started to think, oh, well, she had Oedipal wishes that are come into contradiction with what society wants. Thus, she represses her incestual wishes into her unconscious, and when something in the external world echoes those unconscious wishes, that's where the symptoms manifest. So here we can see that it's, in a way, very, very intra-psychic, in meaning that wishes are impossible to tolerate, thus they're pushed down, and something in the real world echoes them, so therefore they come back with a vengeance, in a way. So here it's going to be, from here on out, it's going to be a real struggle, as the other generational analysts of Freud started to disagree with this pure intra-psychic version that Freud postulated. For example, people like Ferenczi started to say, no, there has been real abuse, and that real abuse has had an impact. We can't deny that. And if you know anything in the history of psychoanalysis, you know that from that point on, Freud started distancing himself. For example, he was very adamant about his theory having to be the main theory in psychoanalysis. For him, it was essential and non-negotiable that we put psychic life before everything else. Not that everything else can't have an impact, but psychic life, fantasies, unconscious, has to come first. And all the other stuff, relational objects, trauma, had to come second or third. And when people like Ferenczi started to push back on this idea, he started really asserting that it had to remain like this. So this created a divide that never fully healed, as even now when you're taught psychoanalysis, you taught psychoanalysis in the fact of how important for discovery was of those unconscious fantasies that are beyond being withstandable with the mind, therefore get repressed. But, and this is a big but, what he first discovered was not wrong. There are people who abuse others. There are people who take power and thus create a dynamic in which they will take control. He wasn't wrong about his first theory. The neurotica isn't in itself wrong. And unfortunately, it is not, how can I say, necessarily that uncommon. And I think that the fact is that his first theory, which was a theory of abuse, has to remain virtually of paramount importance in our minds, as it's not, I don't think it's that rare, nor is it, because it is really destructive when the neurotica happens, when the father really seduced the daughter, in Freud's words. And this is of paramount importance, because if we are to just believe this to be intrapsychic, then there's a whole point of trauma that isn't healed, that isn't taken into by the clinician. And I think that the fact of having an either-or aspect to it was really a bad move. Like, there is something to be said about unconscious fantasies and the Oedipus complex and about incestual internal wishes, right? There's a real conversation to be had on those sins. But to say that these sins negate the real life trauma is wrong also. I think that both should coexist in our minds, that we shouldn't select one or the other, that the wishes, the unconscious wishes, are something of an unconscious mind. They haven't happened. And perhaps the child, in of themselves, are interested in their parents and wish to be close to their parents, but never in this traumatic way. And I think that that's very important, is that Freud was not wrong in the fact that children develop love, care, and tenderness towards the parents, both parents, not just the parent of the opposite sex, both of them. He's not wrong. And the fact that those parents, those love objects, then affect who we then love as adults is incredibly valuable and true. And I think that's beyond being proved. It's just a fact. But it's also very wrong to say or to try and dismiss external trauma. So I think integrating both versions have to be what is the norm, the basis. And unfortunately, it was not the norm for a long time, as Freud really wanted us, as psychodynamic therapists and psychoanalysis, to really remain close to the psychic reality rather than external reality, to not really be contaminated by the external events. And I think that that's also something that isolated us from the world at large, because people, how can I say, are very ambivalent towards internal reality, but external reality is something that they can invest in. And I think that psychoanalysis, by fighting tooth and nail to preserve internal reality at the detriment of external reality, has been in its disfavor. And I think that people like Ferenczi are very, very important, because he was one of the first to try to really adamantly try to change perspectives, to make both theories coexist at the same time. And because Freud was aware that external trauma will also recover, or recouvrir en français, should I say, not recover in the fact of necessarily just healing, but it will overshadow the internal psychic reality. He was very suspicious of it and didn't really want to integrate it, as he felt that it would just take all the space. And in a way, he's not necessarily wrong, as nowadays in our society, this is exactly what happens. External trauma overshadows, overlays on his idea of inner psychic reality and fantasies. But I think that overlayness is also more simple, and I think clinically it's better to have this hypothesis, as people who have been abused need us to also recognize that abuse, to be able to put words upon it. I think there is nothing more violent than to say that this event did not exist or was fantasized. I think that's even going as far as to say it's cruel. I think that what Freud, and what we should take away from Freud, is this fundamental core idea that all of those wishes, those repressed wishes, are what they are, i.e. they're on a fundamental unconscious level that might manifest through behavior, but is never something that the patient is aware of. And once there is awareness, then one can really start to take this hypothesis of trauma to the full extent. And I think that we have to also acknowledge when trauma has happened. I think it's really essential for the healing of the patients. And I think that the fundamental core problem is that because of those conflicting interests very early on in psychoanalysis, it has created this dynamic where there's always been a lot of tension between preserving the listening of the analyst as some form of detached presence, and investing and saying and validating the patient. And I think it's a very, how can I say, tension building phenomena, as for a long time analysts had to pick sides. But throughout the generations, it became less and less like that. It became less and less split, as people like Fernberg and Winnicott put forward both of those elements. And I feel that now with people like Kernberg or Thomas Ogden, we have a synthesis of both, which is just great, because I feel that that's what we needed from the very get-go, a synthesis. Unfortunately, Freud was unable at the time to do that synthesis, as he was afraid, I think, of being overshadowed by real-life trauma, and also he was afraid of the societal consequences of pointing out to the abuse dynamics. And that's my very personal take, my analysis. So don't go out of your way and think that everyone thinks like this. This is my interpretation on phenomena, which may be valid or might be wrong, but please keep in mind how hypothetical it is. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.